Okay, here we go. Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, a little impromptu set alterations. Audio and video look good. It's not the usual night, so a little off the cuff, a little unplugged. All right, here we go. Thank you. We are at war. Yes, we are at war. The weapons are not bullets and bombs. The weapons are words and ideas. But don't be deceived. The results of this war will be, in the end, just as devastating. Looks like we're live. Who are the protagonists? Well, on one side, there are those who believe in American exceptionalism and the fact that we have a constitutional representative republic whose only, I repeat, only function is to secure our God-given natural rights and liberties, which are life, liberty, property, and the right to defend those other rights in the best manner that we can. On the other side are the destructive revolutionaries, the collectivists, communists, Marxist, socialist, statist, globalist, oligarchs, who will not rest until every last vestige of liberty has been erased from the face of the earth. And you know what? They are succeeding. We are surrounded. They have infiltrated their forces everywhere we look. Government, churches, schools, universities, businesses, the ranks of the military, the courts, everywhere. Is it too late? Are we vanquished? Is this the end? Hoosiers, do not despair. There is a way out of this mess. There is a solution. The Constitution solution. Hello, I'm Dr. Chris McGarrah from Warsaw, Indiana, and this is yet another episode of The Constitution Solution. In tonight's impromptu special edition, I will discuss the main weapon of our enemy, the Marxist revolutionaries: critical theory. This week, right here in Kosciuszko County, yes, right here in Kosciuszko County, there have been public meetings on the subject, some very contentious meetings, I might add. On this past Thursday evening, the Kosciuszko County Commissioners hosted Indiana Attorney General Todd Rokita to participate in a town hall meeting on the subject of critical race theory, and specifically using that theory as the basis for instructing, or should I say indoctrinating, our children. At that meeting, one of the local newspaper editors challenged the audience or panelists to concisely define critical race theory, and later in an editorial posed the question of why suddenly did the Kosciuszko County Commissioners find it necessary to take action on the subject of critical race theory. Okay, since no one has answered, it seems that it is up to me your humble servant and simple country doctor, to take up the challenge. For one thing, our federal government has changed. You may have noticed. And so have our schools and other institutions. So how are we the people to respond to such unwarrantable actions? Well, you must go back to James Madison and Federalist 46. In Federalist 46, he shows us four actions to be taken for unwarrantable actions of the federal government. Briefly, they are: number one, the repugnance of the people. Get out and let your voices be heard. Number two, and one of the most important, a refusal to cooperate with the officers of the union. A refusal to cooperate with officers of the union. You can't make the locals enforce federal law. They can't. Number three, the frowns of the executive magistracy, that is, the governor. Well, good luck with that in Indiana. But then there is number four, legislative devices. Yes, legislative devices. Following the 10th Amendment, our state and local and county officials have a duty. Yes, they have a duty to pass resolutions, ordinances, and bills in order to counter this revolution and to secure our God-given natural rights and liberties. And that, Hoosiers, is exactly what all the commotion is about. So, let's get right down to it. What is critical theory? You notice I didn't say critical race theory because that's only one part of critical theory. If you want a really good explanation of this from its inception until today, I highly recommend, like I said, folks, this is very impromptu. This book, Cynical Theories. Cynical Theories. You can find this wherever fine books are sold, maybe even on Amazon. It's by two authors, Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay. That's Lindsay. Critical Theories. The subtitle is How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, and Identity, and Why This Harms Everybody. This is a real chapter and verse, complete analysis of critical theory, which is just not critical race theory. It's critical colonial theory, queer theory, feminist theory. There are many theories, all lumped under the heading of critical theory. So again, cynical theories. You read this, you'll know everything there is to know about it. It's a little detailed. So, taking up the challenge of that newspaper editor, I was looking around for something more simple. And of course, I found it. And that is an episode of Hillsdale College's newsletter, The Imprimis. Specifically, this was from the March 2021 Imprimis, Volume 50, Number 3, March 2021. Critical Race Theory, What It Is and How to Fight It, by author Christopher F. Rufo, R-U-F-O. I will take up the edit challenge and tell you a little bit about critical theory, specifically race theory, from Mr. Rufo's article. Now, given the constraints of time, what I'm going to do is read from his short article here. I know that might bore some of you, but pay attention. His words are very good. So I'm just going to repeat them, and I'll try not to drone on. Unfortunately, this little booklet, the pages tend to stick together, but I'll do best I can. So here we go. Critical race theory is fast becoming America's new institutional orthodoxy, yet most Americans have never heard of it. And those who have, many don't understand it. Don't blame you. I didn't at first. It's time for this to change. We need to know what it is so we can know how to fight it. In critical race theory, it helps to begin with a brief history of Marxism. Remember, it's always best to start at the beginning. Originally, the Marxist left built its political program on the theory of class conflict. The solution to that imbalance, according to Marx, was revolution. Violent revolution. The workers would eventually gain consciousness of their, seize the means of production, overthrow the capitalist class, and usher in a new social society. A utopia. How'd that work out for us? I go on here. In practice, Marx's ideas unleashed man's darkest qualities. Now here we come back to the critical theory, the harmless academic theory that you hear people talk, or its proponents talk about it like that. Here we go. By the mid-1960s, Marxist intellectuals, the West, had begun to acknowledge the failures of Marxism. You can kill hundreds of millions of people. It still doesn't work. They recoiled at the revelations of Soviet atrocities and came to realize that revolutions would never occur in Western Europe or the United States, where large middle classes and rapidly improving standards of living. But these clever Marxists, but rather than abandon their leftist political project, Marxist scholars in the West, Marxist scholars in the West simply adapted their revolutionary theory to the social and racial unrest of the 1960s. They morph. So instead of being about in economics, it's now about race. Abandoning Marx's economic dialectic of capitalists and workers, they substituted race for class and sought to create a revolutionary coalition of the dispossessed based on racial and ethnic categories. And now we add to the sexual categories, identity politics. He goes on, fortunately for us, Americans in the 60s preferred the idea of improving their country to that of overthrowing it. The vision of Martin Luther King prevailed. But the radical left has proved resilient and enduring, which brings us to critical race theory. Those Marxists, they're always out there just waiting for another chance. At first, if you don't succeed, try again. Okay, now everyone, this is it. This is the simple definition of critical race theory. Get out your pens and pencils so you can tell that newspaper editor you know what it is and you can describe it in 147 characters or less. Okay, here's the big answer. Drum roll. Critical race theory is an academic discipline formulated in the 1990s, built on the intellectual framework of identity-based Marxism. That wasn't so hard, was it? Let me repeat that. Critical race theory is an academic discipline formulated in the 1990s, built upon the intellectual framework of identity-based Marxism. And Mr. Rufo goes on, relegated for many years to universities and obscure academic journals. Over the past decade, it has increasingly become the default ideology in our public institutions. It has been injected into government agencies, public school systems, teacher training programs, and corporate human resource departments in the form of diversity training programs, human resources modules, public policy frameworks, and school curricula. There are a series of euphemisms deployed by its supporters to describe critical race theory, including equity. Now, remember, equity is not the same as equality. Big difference. Get to that later. So the euphemisms, equity, social justice, diversity and inclusion, and culturally responsive teaching. Critical race theorists, masters of language construction, realize that neo-Marxism would be a hard sell. Yeah, okay, today we're going to teach a little Jill and Johnny and about neo-Marxism. Parents would go, oh, no, you're not. But we're going to teach about equity. And we're fooled. Equity, on the other hand, sounds non-threatening, warm and fuzzy, and is easily confused with the American principle of equality. Equity, equality. But Hoosier's words matter. He goes on, but the distinction is vast and important. Indeed, equality, the principle proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence, defended in the Civil War, and codified into law with the 14th and 15th Amendments, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, is explicitly rejected by critical race theorists. To them, equality represents mere non-discrimination and provides camouflage for white supremacy, patriarchy, and oppression. In contrast to equality, equity as defined and promoted by critical race theorists, is little more than reformulated Marxism. Remember, critical race theory is nothing but reformulated Marxism. Reformulated Marxism. So next time some smart aleck asks you to simply define it, say, it's nothing but reformulated Marxism. In the name of equity, UCLA law professor and critical race theorist Cheryl Harris has proposed suspending private property rights, seizing land and wealth, and redistributing them along racial lines. Another critical race guru, here, let me move on, has proposed the creation of a federal Department of Anti-Racism, which would have the power to nullify, veto, and abolish any law at any level of government and curtail the speech of political leaders and others who are deemed insufficiently anti-racist. Right. You're going to come and take my property and take my wealth to redistribute it. Good luck with that. One practical result of the creation of such a department would be the overthrow of capitalism, since according to these experts, pay attention, Hoosiers, in order to be truly anti-racist, you also have to be truly anti-capitalist. In other words, here's the point. Identity is the means and Marxism is the end. Identity is the means and Marxism is the end. So don't be fooled by any nice little kindergarten teacher that's trying to convince you that critical race theory is just warm and fuzzy and just something academics argue about. They're coming after your and your children and your property and your rights. Identity is the means and Marxism is the end. He goes on. An equity-based form of government would mean the end not only of private property, but also of individual rights, equality under the law, federalism, and freedom of speech. These would be replaced by race-based redistribution of wealth, group-based rights, active discrimination, and omnipotent bureaucratic authority. Historically, the accusation of anti-Americanism has been overused, but in this case, it's not a matter of interpretation. Critical race theory prescribes a revolutionary program that would overturn the principles of the Declaration and destroy the remaining structure of the Constitution. Did you catch that? Critical race theory prescribes a revolutionary program that would overturn the principles of the Declaration and destroy the remaining structure of the Constitution. So how does it work? Well, you've all heard the horror stories. And this author, Mr. Rufo, goes on to say, I'm just one investigative journalist, but I've developed a database of more than 1,000 of these stories. When I say that critical race theory is becoming the operating ideology of our public institutions, it is not an exaggeration. From universities to bureaucracies to K through 12 school systems. Critical race theory has permeated the collective intelligence and decision-making process of American government with no sign of slowing down. This is a revolutionary change. Period. He goes on. Today, under the increasing sway of critical race theory and related ideologies, they are being turned against the American people, the institutions, that is. This isn't limited to the permanent bureaucracy in Washington, D.C., but is true as well of institutions in the states, even red states, and it is spreading to county public health departments, small Midwestern school districts, and more. This ideology will not stop until it has devoured all of our institutions. Yes, Hoosiers, we have trouble right here in Warsaw, Indiana. He goes on. Thus far, attempts to halt the encroachment of critical race theory have been ineffective. There are a number of reasons for this. First, too many Americans have developed an acute fear of speaking up about social and political issues, especially those involving race. Second, critical race theorists have constructed their argument like a mousetrap. Now, this is important. They've constructed this like a mousetrap. Disagreement with their program becomes irrefutable evidence of a dissenter's white fragility, unconscious bias, or internalized white supremacy. So just to disagree with it, just to say, let's have an honest discussion about this, they say, well, that proves our theory. No. Third, Americans across the political spectrum have failed to separate the premise of critical race theory from its conclusion. The premise that American history includes slavery and other injustices, and that we should examine and learn from history, that is undeniable. But its revolutionary conclusion that America was founded on and defined by racism, and that our founding principles, our Constitution, and our way of life should be overthrown, does not rightly, much less necessarily follow. That is the flaw of critical theory. Fourth and finally, the writers and activists who have had the courage to speak out against critical race theory have tended to address it on the theoretical level. It's just a harmless bunch of academics out there at the university. There's no practical implication. How about burned out cities? They point out that the theory's logical contradictions and dishonest account of history. Let me read that again. I think I stopped and lost the point. Fourth and finally, the writers and activists who have had the courage to speak out against critical race theory have tended to address it on the theoretical level, pointing out the theory's logical contradictions and dishonest account of history. These criticisms are worthy and good, but they move the debate into the academic realm, which is friendly territory for the proponents of critical race theory. They fail to force defenders of this revolutionary ideology to defend the practical consequences of their ideas in the realm of politics. And he goes on. No longer simply an academic matter, critical race theory has become a tool of political power. To borrow a phrase from the Marxist theoretician Antonio Gramsci, Gramsci, Antonio Gramsci, it is fast achieving cultural hegemony in America's public institutions. More and more it is driving the vast machinery of the state and society. If we want to succeed in opposing it, we must address it politically at every level, and hence the Kosciuszko County Commissioners. Critical race theorists must be confronted with and forced to speak to the facts. There are three parts to a successful strategy to defeat the forces of critical race theory. Number one, governmental action. Number two, grassroots mobilization. That's you. And an appeal to principle. Number one, we already see examples of governmental action. Last year, one of my reports led President Trump to issue an executive order banning critical race theory-based training programs in the federal government. President Biden, or should I say the Harris-Biden administration, rescinded this order on his first day in office, but it provides a model for governors and municipal leaders to follow. This year, several state legislatures have introduced bills to achieve the same goal, preventing public institutions from conducting programs that stereotype, scapegoat, or demean people on the basis of race. And I have organized a coalition of attorneys to file lawsuits against schools and government agencies that impose critical race theory-based programs on the grounds of First Amendment, which protects citizens from compelled speech, the 14th Amendment, which provides equal protection under the law, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits public institutions from discriminating on the basis of race. So you see, critical race theory is illegal, unconstitutional. Poof, it should be gone. Okay, that was governmental. Number two, on the grassroots level, that's you, Hoosier activists. A multiracial and bipartisan coalition is emerging to do battle against critical race theory. Parents are mobilizing against racially divisive curricula. Parents are mobilizing against racially divisive curricula in public schools, and employees are increasingly speaking out against Orwellian re-education in the workforce. It happens. I can testify. When they see what is happening, Americans are naturally outraged that critical race theory promotes three ideas. Talking point here, get your pencils out, Hoosiers. Critical race theory promotes three ideas: race essentialism, collective guilt, and neo-segregation, all of which violate the basic principles of equality and justice. So critical race theory is bad. It's bad. It promotes inequality and injustice. He goes on, in terms of principles, we need to employ our own moral language rather than allow ourselves to be confined by the categories of critical race theory. For example, we often find ourselves debating diversity. Diversity, as most of us understand, it is generally good, all things being equal, but it is of secondary value. We should be talking about aiming at excellence, a common standard that challenges people of all backgrounds to achieve their potential. On the scale of desirable ends, excellence beats diversity every time. Similarly, in addition to pointing out the dishonesty of the historical narrative on which critical race theory is predicated, we must promote the true story of America. A story that is honest about injustices in American history, but that places them in the context of our nation's high ideals and the progress we have made towards realizing them. Genuine American history is rich with stories of achievements and sacrifices that will move the hearts of Americans, in stark contrast to the grim, pessimistic narrative pressed by the critical race theorists. Above all, we must have courage, the fundamental virtue required in our time. Courage to stand up and speak the truth. Courage to withstand the epithets. Courage to face the mob. Courage to shrug off the scorns of the elites. When enough of us overcome the fear that currently prevents so many from speaking out, we hold that critical race theory will begin to slip. And courage begets courage. Just like the Cowardly Lion and the Wizard of Oz. It's easy to stop a lone dissenter, but it is much harder to stop 10, 20, 100, 1,000, 100,000 or more who stand up together for the principles of America. Truth and justice are on our side. If we can muster the courage, we will win. Well, that was Christopher Rufo's Imprimis. Look it up, study it. Like I say, the short answer to what is critical race theory is right there. You can memorize it, repeat it off whenever any questioning newspaper editor wants to know. Well, so Hoosiers, come to an end here. But now remember, doctor's orders. Wash your hands. Don't touch your face. But above all, keep your distance. Keep distance from the socialist, statist, globalist, collectivist politicians and bureaucrats. Because, Hoosiers, you now know who they are. The curtain has been pulled back. They can no longer hide. We, the people, will go to the polls in 2022, not too long from now, and we, the people, will have change. We will prevail. Now, I will see you again on August the 5th. That's a Thursday night. Next episode of the Constitution Solution, where we will resume discussing the Indiana Constitution, and I believe we're up to Article 9. So good night, Hoosiers. And as they say on every episode of the JBS Constitution Corner, just don't know your Constitution. Live it. Good night.